million for hanging around when we had a few technical difficulties there. So our power went, but we have another power source now. So my name is Feeney. I'm a postdoctoral researcher in UCD with Food for Health Ireland. Food for Health Ireland is a unique consortium of dairy researchers around the country and also some dairy industry partners as well. So as you'll see, we have a whole load of research going on in different areas. So these are some of our different pillars. We have research in the areas of technology, sports and ageing, metabolic health, infant nutrition, and then of course for today, most importantly, healthy cheeses. So I'm going to talk to you today about healthy cheeses and about how cheese really can be healthy. So within the Healthy Cheeses work package, we look at a few different things. We look at potential health benefits from cheese, which I know some people might be surprised by. We also look at bioactive peptides from cheese, and then we look at cheese and satiety as well. So cheese has actually been a really important nutrient source in Europe for at least 8,000 years. And dairy foods remain a really important nutrient source in Ireland. So we can see this diagram here is from some pottery shards that were found in Poland, and they're from some of the first early dairy farmers. And really cheese back then, we now in Europe, we all are able mostly to digest lactose. But back then, these early dairy farmers weren't able to digest lactose. So cheese was a way of making milk digestible for these farmers, and really it was a way of having a portable, concentrated nutrient source from them. So this data is from a recent study that was published from UCD, and it really shows the contribution of dairy foods and of cheese to nutrients in the Irish population. So you can see cheese contributes around 2.3% of energy within Ireland as a population as a whole. But it also contributes almost 10% of calcium and of retinol intake, and it's also a significant contributor to riboflavin and vitamin B12 as well. So we can see that, we always think of cheese in terms of calcium, but it actually does contribute quite significantly to some other nutrients there as well. And in addition, it's actually not as strongly a contributor to energy as we might have thought. Now, one of the big things with cheese, of course, is the fat content. We can see that in terms of overall fat, cheese contributes about 5% in Ireland, but it contributes about 8.3% of saturated fat, and that's because a lot of the fat in cheese is saturated. And because of this is why cheese has a really poor public perception. So just to give you an idea of some of the newspaper headlines that we have seen in the last few years: saltier than seawater, the tasty foreign cheeses that people love sprinkling over their salads. And then this one, which I love, is "My love of cheese nearly cost me my leg. Why high cholesterol doesn't just damage your heart." So this really drives home the perception that we have that cheese will raise your cholesterol. So what I'm going to show you now is actually that perception is wrong. So first of all, if we think about saturated fat, and we know that cheese is high in saturated fat, and all of these fats, they all fit under this term, this blanket term, saturated fat. But actually, we have a lot of different types of saturated fats. Some of them are short chain, some medium and some long chain, and they all have very different effects. So for example, if we just look at palmitic acid and stearic acid, they have very different effects in terms of how they can raise LDL cholesterol. So we really need to be looking beyond the terms saturated fat and actually considering the individual fatty acids that are in foods as well, because foods all contain very different types. So as well as that, you can see not only do the individual fatty acids all have different biological effects, but different foods have very different types of fatty acids within them. And more recently, we're starting to see this. So a very recent meta-analysis looked at what we are eating and looked at risk of heart disease and so on. And what we've seen from this is saturated fatty acids from meat and meat products are associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. But what's really interesting about this is that saturated fat from dairy products are actually associated with a decreased risk of cardiovascular disease, which really goes against what we're told in the media quite a bit. So we're starting to term this the dairy matrix effect. So why do we see a difference with dairy products? So if we think of dairy products, they're quite high in a lot of things. Obviously sodium and saturated fats, two big concerns, but also calcium and magnesium and retinol that we talked about earlier on. But then when it comes to cheese is a little bit special. We also have bioactive peptides in cheese, and cheese is a natural source of these. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But so what we can see with this is that some of these nutrients are negative when you consider them in isolation, so particularly sodium and saturated fats, but some of them are positive, and we have to consider that cheese is a matrix that contains all of these things. So just to go through, as I mentioned, there's a lot now of scientific evidence that actually shows an association, a positive association with cheese consumption and cardiovascular health in the last 10 to 15 years. So just to point out some of these studies, we can see the Salt Stuff in 2006 found that cheese consumption was beneficially neutral. We find in 2009, some more recent study, the Engerbrink study, found that high-fat dairy was actually associated with a reduced risk of hypertension. And again, another study in 2009 found an association of triglycerides and HDL, that they were higher in those with the greatest cheese intake. So the HDL, if we remember, is the good cholesterol, whereas the LDL cholesterol is what we would consider the bad cholesterol. Again, some more studies find that dairy is not associated with cardiovascular risk, and then Nielsen in 2014 found that self-reported cheese consumption was actually associated with a reduced blood pressure. So there's a lot of association studies there that do suggest that there are some health benefits from cheese. So just to sum them up generally, dairy foods are associated with a lower blood pressure, and that's been quite consistent across all of the studies. And it's either beneficial or neutral for cardiovascular disease. Cheese consumption then is either neutral or has a positive impact in association studies where heart health markers have been examined. And then finally, healthier blood lipid profiles, so higher HDL, lower HDL and lower triglycerides, tend to be seen with cheese consumption. So then just to show you some data that we have from our Irish population, we have seen the same thing. So we had a group of 1,500 people that we had a detailed 4-day food diary from these people. Within these people, we also had blood samples as well. So we had really detailed information from over 1,500 people. What we did was we divided them into 4 groups, so non-consumers of cheese, and then the consumers, we divided them into low, medium and high consumers of cheese. And what you can't see here is that the high consumers had a significantly greater percent energy coming from saturated fat. So we would assume that those people would have also then higher triglycerides, higher LDL cholesterol and so on. But when we look at this graph, what we can see is that actually there was no difference across these groups in terms of their metabolic syndrome risks. This was a marker that we calculated based on a range of the blood biomarkers. There was no difference in their triglyceride level, their HDL or their LDL levels. So it was very interesting to see that, because if we think of what we were told and the advice that we get from our GPs and so on, we would have expected to see LDL cholesterol as being higher in these people. So it really points to the fact that it's not just about the saturated fat content that we're eating, it's also about the foods, and we really have to consider the food matrix. Of course, intervention studies can only tell us so much, association studies can only tell us so much. They can tell us whether things are associated or correlated, but they can't give us any idea of cause and effect. We have to do intervention studies for these. And there is a lot of intervention studies in the last 15 years that shows cheese consumption is actually not LDL cholesterol raising. So one of the seminal studies here was the Salstrup study in 2004, and they actually thought they'd done something wrong when they looked at their data originally. So as you can see in this study, they had 14 healthy males, so quite a small study, student population aged between 20 to 31, and they gave them 205 grams of cheese a day per 10 megajoules of energy intake. So just to put that into perspective, some of these guys were having 14 and 15 megajoules per day, so over 250 grams of cheese for some of these guys over the course of this 3-week period. And what they found was actually that the fasting LDL level was lower with the cheese diet than for their butter diet, even though the saturated fatty acid profile was exactly the same because they were made from the same milk. So what we're seeing here is really demonstrating that the food matrix is really important, and we have to look beyond saturated fat and really consider where that saturated fat is coming from. So I won't go through all of the studies, but just to show you that there's been, since the 2004 study, there has been a lot more of these. They've been looking at different cheeses, camemberts, cheddars and so on. More recently, a 2016 study found again that cheese lowered LDL cholesterol without increasing bile acids. So just to summarise the intervention studies, which as I've said is the strongest scientific evidence, we can see that cheese consumption results in a healthier overall blood lipid profile with higher LDL, lower higher HDL, lower LDL, and generally lower triglycerides. Now, we don't fully understand why this is happening, and some questions remain about these studies. So is this effect due to the calcium content of cheese? Do all cheeses have the same effect, and is it seen for all populations? So we're terming this effect the food matrix effect. And what we think is happening is that the calcium content of cheese in some way appears to be preventing the absorption of the fat and the saturated fat in the gut. There also appears to be some sort of link with the fermentation of bacteria, with the different starter cultures of cheese, and there's also some structural differences within the fat content of the cheese versus butter in terms of the milk fat globule membrane. So there's some sphingolipids that are present in cheese that we don't necessarily see in butter after it has been churned. But mainly we think that there's something also happening with the bioactive peptides. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about bioactive peptides now. So cheese is what we term a natural source of these peptides. When we make cheese, we take milk, we separate it out, and then the cheese really is just, all the lactose is removed, and it's mainly protein and fat. As cheese ripens, there's proteolysis that happens, and various bioactive peptides are generated. So peptides that have activity that's not seen in the parent protein. And cheese is ideal for this because casein is perfect protein for this to happen with. In FHI, we're looking at a whole range of different things in terms of bioactive peptides. So one of the packages in FHI is looking at whether or not different cheeses are made in different ways, whether or not they differ in terms of their bioactivity. So if you think about how we then ripen cheeses, we can have mould ripened cheeses, washed rind and blue vein cheeses, and they may all have different bioactivities. And in fact, from FHI, we can see that they actually do have quite different bioactivities. So this is an antioxidant assay, and it looks kind of complicated, but just to show you that we've looked at white mould cheeses, washed rind cheeses and blue vein cheeses, and we can see that actually some of the blue vein cheeses are quite high in terms of their antioxidant activity, which perhaps is not something you would expect from a cheese. If we then look at something called a DPP4 assay, so this is an assay that looks at glycemic management, so in other words, blood glucose control, we can see that it's quite different. We can see that actually some of the white mould cheeses are higher in terms of their bioactivity. So the bioactive peptides in those cheeses are quite high. And then finally, we're also looking at determining when is the best time to eat our cheeses in terms of how much bioactivity there is in there. So we can see these are for a range of different cheddar and regado cheeses, so hard cheeses, rather than the previous slides that showed soft cheeses. And you can see that the bioactivity actually increases over time, which makes sense because the cheese is ripening, there's proteolysis happening. And we can see that when the cheeses hit around 10 months, one of them has started to decrease, so it has peaked at 8 months. But we can see that some of them are still increasing, and that study is ongoing. But it's really interesting to see that actually, potentially in the future, it won't be about when your cheese is perfect to taste. Maybe it'll be about when your cheese is perfect in terms of its health properties. So just a quick plug then for the cheese study that's happening in UCD. So as we've said, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the saturated fat in cheese does not raise LDL cholesterol levels. This matrix effect is not fully understood yet, and in UCD we're trying to investigate this further. And actually we have a member of our volunteers in the audience today. But we have people on 4 different diets within UCD on this to try and test the cheese matrix effect. Everyone is given the same amount of dairy fat, but they're given it in different forms over 6 weeks, and they come in for blood tests at the beginning and again at the end. The inclusion criteria are that they're over 50, that they have a BMI of 25 or over, and that they're not on any kind of cholesterol lowering medication or any kind of blood pressure lowering medication either. So as you can see here, everyone is matched. So in terms of the overall protein, carbohydrate and fat content, the diets are all matched. So the only thing that differs across these diets is the form or the matrix of the cheese. So we're hoping that we'll have the results for that study soon, but if anyone is interested in taking part, we're still looking for volunteers. So finally, just to finish up and show you that cheese can also be a protein source for an ageing population. So we know that by 2050, Ireland is expected to have almost 6.3 million people, and over a quarter of those will be over 65. So we need to find new protein sources to try and combat some of the particular nutrition problems that come along with that, such as sarcopenia, which is a big issue and will be by then. So potentially, now that we know that there's not as many issues with the fat as we thought with cheese, cheese may actually offer an affordable protein source for these people. So just to summarise, cheese has a range of health benefits. It's a natural source of bioactive peptides, and we're still finding out even more about those activities. But there's been known peptides that have antihypertensive activity, antioxidant activity, and immunomodulation activity. It provides a range of nutrients. It's low in lactose, so it's suitable for people who are lactose intolerant, who perhaps can't tolerate milk products. It's high in saturated fat, yes, but it doesn't appear to raise LDL cholesterol, and in some cases that actually results in a better ratio of LDL to HDL cholesterol. And then finally, there is some sort of matrix effect going on, and we have ongoing studies in UCD to try and understand that. But really, the bottom line here is cheese can be safely consumed, even in large amounts, as part of a healthy, balanced diet. So just to thank some of the people who are involved in some of these other studies, cheese ripening studies, from Moore Park. There's also a Healthy Cheeses team down there. If anyone's interested, you can follow us, FHI, on Twitter. We're FHI_phase2. And then finally, just the cheese study is recruiting, so a little plug for the cheese study. Thank you.